its oil mines or security contractors in Iraq. So there is a way in the physical world in which you can protect that. So really what I'm saying is, in the real world, we like certainty, we like security. And so as MMOs become more immersive and more substantial investments are made, these issues are going to come to the fore. And if developers don't provide greater certainty and security, the market will seek to adjust and go somewhere else, or just lower the investment in proportion to the risk. And if a game doesn't provide a player with sufficient rights in the player's endeavour, again, the player might migrate or spend less time and money in the game. Now, the issue of who should own what content is a question of balance, and it can get resolved either in the courts or by the market. But ultimately, people want a reward of some description. Now, reward can just be having a great time. You don't care, really. Having fun in the game, that's all you really care about. But think a bit into the future when these games become much more immersive. People spend more and more time in their virtual reality. It reminds me of a joke that I heard. It must have been close to 10 years ago when those first virtual reality games were coming in, and you have the thing on your head, and this chap said, "So what's virtual reality like?" And the guy goes, "It's awesome. It's just like normal reality, except you're wearing a hat." Right. Okay. So we like reward, and not too long ago, a Pennsylvania lawyer by the name of Mark Bragg discovered a way in which, in Second Life, he could acquire cheap property, undervalued property. He was abiding by the terms and conditions, abiding by, if you like, the kind of the gameplay, but it was a quirk in software. And after acquiring assets through his method, came to the intention of doing that. They then used their almighty power to confiscate those assets and deny him access to his account. Now, he had invested a lot of time and money in this. And Mr. Bragg took them to court, claimed that they had breached various trade practices and consumer laws by unfairly terminating his account. The case was settled only earlier this month, and you often don't know what goes on behind the scenes in settlement. There are agreed press releases. But this one might tell a little bit of the story. It basically says that there were a series of, quote, unfortunate disagreements and miscommunications, and that now Mr. Bragg's account, privileges and responsibilities to Second Life have now all been restored. So looking at the issue more positively, it indicates that there are opportunities for both developers and players. For developers to be clear about the ownership of virtual assets. The more games and end-user agreements reflect real-world expectations of security and reward, the more immersive they'll be. And the potential lack of these factors will hamper their growth in real-world dollar value. So, in its role as God, overseer, or benevolent dictator, the developer really has the power to offer the same security, the same incentives that exist. But they also have the power to go further, I think. We might not see this for a little bit of time, but I'm sure we will. And the end-user agreement is really the prime mechanism by which developers can go further. It's the social contract that binds the virtual world. In the real world, we don't actually have written agreements between us in this room, so there needs to be an umbrella of laws that sit outside that and deal very imperfectly with the relationships that we might have. But in a virtual game, everyone's bound by the contract. So the developer could create a game in which intellectual property rights are much more clearly defined, which would encourage more creation and the exchange of ideas, and really to provide an ever more enjoyable game. Certainly when this happens, I'll buy an island and probably retire there. At the end of the day, we like games, and I think if one was created like that, as I say, I'd probably live there. That's the end of my presentation. I've finished a little bit early, partly because I really prefer to take questions from the floor and make it more of an interactive experience. So if there are any questions about what I've talked about, or really happy to field any other legal questions that you might have even beyond that, which I'll try and answer. A bit blinded by the light, so sing out whoever's raising their hand.
International copyright law varies from country to country in some situations. So what do you call that today? How do we adjust international distribution?
There are some variations, but for a large number of countries that are parties to what's known as the Berne Convention, there are remarkable similarities. Certainly when I deal with English and American lawyers, we're talking a very common language. And certainly England, Australia and America, Canada, all enjoy the same theories of that balance. The incentives, the exceptions to exceptions. There are some differences. For example, the American fair use system is different to ours. It's not, however, as broad as many people think it is. Fair use isn't just an argument about whether I nick your stuff, is that fair? There are some quite clear guidelines as to what constitutes fairness. In Australia, what's constituted as fair is fairly itemised in our Copyright Act. Things like research, reporting news, that type of stuff. And so, while there are some differences, the theory is pretty much the same.
I was at a virtual worlds conference up in Sydney earlier this week, and one of the things came up, interesting to get your opinion on, is you have somebody that's taken a photograph of the building and is then using that as a texture in a game or in a virtual world product. It comes back to who does really own that content at the end of the day. Is it the architect, is it the owner of the building, is it the person that took the photograph, or is it the gamer that compiled it? Comment on that?
Yeah, look, it's in many ways much the same as the issues associated with films. Buildings, in fact, get specific treatment under our Copyright Act. For example, in a film, you wouldn't infringe copyright that exists in a building, which is ultimately the architect plans, by filming a scene which had buildings in it. Enormous relief to a lot of gamers who have those, a bit like Team Bondi's upcoming, I forgot what its name. Thank you, LA Noir, which was set, I think, 1950s in LA, rolling through the streets of LA. Enormous amount of buildings would have been reproduced, but in this context, it's a film, and to the extent that they're reproduced, it's not an issue there. Taking your example, there could be problems a little bit further back along the line, such as does the developer have the permission of the person who took the photograph, who tends to be the owner of the copyright, to start making copies of that photograph, even if it's for the purpose of doing a skin. So you just need to take it step by step with copyright. And the starting position usually is who's the creator of the content. And in photographs, it's usually the person who takes the photo, unless it's a commissioned photograph for a private or domestic use, in which case the person who commissioned it, but putting that aside. So it's the person who took the photograph. Has the developer got a license from the photographer to make copies of it, which might just be the process of doing skins. When you get to the actual skins itself, and then you compare the nature of the skins with the original photograph, you might not actually see many differences. So there may not even be a substantial reproduction at the end of the day, but you might get caught up in the process along the way. I can't see anything. I think there's a hand up the back.
Yeah, as far as dealing with like virtual real estate, I mean, do you see a pattern in the future as far as people actually trying to protect those rights of their own property?
I think it's really natural. I mean, it's a bit like the poor chap who went nuts over his sword. If you're spending a lot of time and a lot of money on these things, there's a real expectation of protection. And I mean, with Mr. Bragg, the Pennsylvania lawyer, he was certainly willing to spend a lot of time mucking around in court, dealing with a company with a lot more money probably than he has. So yeah, I expect that type of thing to continue more and more. And I mean,